We have a very interesting development in negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. Reuters, it seems, obtained a word for word copy of the European/Ukrainian peace proposal, intended to counter a US proposal from earlier in the week. The document was first circulated during a summit among Western officials in London, and it shows that we are still far away from a ceasefire, given the disagreement within Western circles. Never mind Russia. It is not that long, only 289 words. So, today, I want to read through the entire thing with you and discuss how it will or will not work. The beginning is just a couple of headers. Official sensitive indicating that we are not supposed to be seeing it. Whoops. And then the title of this being the Russia-Ukraine Deal Framework. I think that the word framework needs to be emphasized here because a document of less than 300 words is going to leave a lot of open questions. Anyway, it has 4 sections, so let's go through each of them. Ceasefire is up first, and again, these are actual quotes. Commit to a full and unconditional ceasefire in the sky, on land, and at sea. Basic enough, though shame on them for not using an Oxford comma. Also, I am very glad to see that a super scientific poll showed that this is a popular opinion. Subpoint 2. Both sides immediately enter into negotiations on technical implementation, with the participation of the United States and European countries. This is in parallel to preparation of the agenda and modalities for a full peace deal. Okay, that is fine again. One thing that many people do not realize is that there is often a huge delay between when a ceasefire begins and when the terms of a settlement are actually agreed to. In the 20th century, the delay was 303.7 days on average. The second subpoint is merely outlining how to handle that process. Subpoint 3. There will be ceasefire monitoring led by the United States and supported by third countries. It is a little unclear what this means. Are we literally talking about just watching things? If so, that is fine. US intel can handle that, and you could convince the Trump administration to go along with it. But are we talking about US boots on the ground as the primary monitor? There is language that we will get to later that would seem to suggest that this is not the case. However, if it is, then we are already off the rails from what is feasible. I had a video only a couple of days ago about Trump doctrine and the United States' prioritization of the Indo-Pacific region. The United States is not going to be taking charge of anything in Europe anytime soon, and to even suggest going down this route is just wasting everyone's time. I thought that there was a basic understanding of this before the NATO Defense Minister Summit back in February, but certainly Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's comments and the following discussion from that should have erased all doubts. And sure, we could have a long conversation about whether this is good US policy or not, but that does not change the fact that it is US policy. That policy is not changing, and there is no point in suggesting otherwise. I could even see this as being counterproductive, as the Trump administration might look at it and see it as further evidence that Europe is not serious about taking charge of the continent's own security affairs. So, if you want this to be serious, it probably needs to read led by Europe and supported by the United States, not the other way around. Subpoint 4. Russia must unconditionally return all deported and illegally displaced Ukrainian children. Exchange all prisoners of war, the principle of all for all. Russia must release all civilian prisoners. Again, pretty simple stuff about what happens at the end of wars. You can foresee problems with the enforceability of the children part, though, but that is going to be a problem no matter how the war ends, even if Russia were magically pushed off all of Ukrainian territory tomorrow. Part 2 is on security guarantees for Ukraine. Subpoint 1. Ukraine receives robust security guarantees, including from the United States, Article 5-like agreement, while there is no consensus among allies on NATO membership. Major problem here. There is an inconsistency between these two phrases. What makes Article 5 work is not the fact that there is a treaty that says that Article 5 is a thing. You cannot just snap your fingers and credibly say, Well, now I'm going to defend them. It is the process of joining NATO, the political screening, and the military integration. That is what makes the intervention threat credible. So, sure, I suppose you could have an Article 5-like agreement, which is a hard phrase to say with a straight face. But Russia is not going to believe that there will be any follow-through to it. Not the least because no one seems particularly enthusiastic about fighting in Ukraine now. 2 months later, and signatures on a flimsy sheet of paper are not going to change that. Now, security guarantees in conjunction with troop movements will have some meaningful impact, if for no other reason than materiel and training have tangible effects. Just do not expect the full weight and force of a full-scale intervention in response to a Russian attack that violates a ceasefire. Also, again, huge question on how you get the United States to support this. Europe, maybe, but good luck on Washington. Subpoint 2. No restrictions on the Ukrainian Defense Forces. No issue there. It has been a key point of Special Envoy to Ukraine Keith Kellogg's peace plan all along, so there is consensus on the Western side. The Kremlin will not like it, of course, but there is not much recourse there for them either. The only way to stop that is to literally fight forever. And Ukraine needs to be able to keep building weapons. Otherwise, Russia's natural military recovery will start drifting the balance of power away from the settlement line, and we will end up back in renegotiations or war. Subpoint 3. The guarantor states will be an ad hoc group of European countries and willing non-European countries. No restrictions on the presence, weapons, and operations of friendly forces on the territory of Ukraine. 2 points here. First, now the document makes it seem like the United States will not be the leading tripwire or reassurance force on the ground, which would resolve the earlier concern. But I am still going to mark that as unclear for now. Second, this is where Russia will get upset, and actually has the ability to veto the proposal. The way the whole thing is structured is that there needs to be a ceasefire for Europe to even enter Ukraine. So as long as the Kremlin believes that continued war under the status quo is better than what happens next, then the status quo will persist. The solution for Europe here is to unilaterally enter Ukraine in non-combat roles and establish credibility. But we all know that such bold action has not happened yet, and that allows Russia's veto power to persist. Subpoint 4. Ukraine pursues accession to the European Union. Actually, the Kremlin said that this is not an issue. I find that interesting because an economic union is what eventually makes military intervention credible. Never mind that the Maidan started on account of trade bloc politics. But hey, that is just me. Topic number 3 is territory. Subpoint 1. Territorial issues will be discussed and resolved after a full and unconditional ceasefire. Fairly normal stuff again here. But it is funny. Whether a ceasefire is acceptable or not depends on expectations about where the line will be drawn afterward. So leaving this for afterward leaves a monumental gap in what needs to be resolved to end the conflict. Subpoint 2, which tries to get to that. Territorial negotiations start from the basis of the line of control. And now we need to have a real talk moment. Only a few days before this document leaked, a US ceasefire proposal was also leaked and was widely panned online. Now, there were parts of it that included unnecessary concessions that massively depart from long-running Western goals, like the US recognition of Russian sovereignty of Crimea. But there was also plenty of trashing the proposal based on Russia holding on to much of the territory that it has taken since the start of the invasion. But here we are, and the joint Europe and Ukraine proposal has the exact same thing baked into it. And I understand why people are upset at the notion of Russia taking land by force. But we do not live in a magical world where we can just snap our fingers and return to the world of the status quo ex ante. If that is what you want to do, then you have to have a plan ready to execute it. Because Russia is not going to be doing Ukraine any kind of favors by voluntarily leaving. And the fact of the matter is, after more than 3 years of fighting, it does not seem like Ukraine has a reasonable chance to do that. Now that we are in 2025, it is easy to point to Donald Trump and say that he is the reason why. And obviously, he has not been helping the matter. But the same was true in 2024 when Joe Biden was president, and Europe has not done enough either before or after the US presidential election. You might point out that Donald Trump was working in the background during that time, hamstringing any efforts to get more arms to Ukraine. But that is still reflecting the underlying preference of a gigantic constituency in the United States. In sum, if there is going to be a deal, it is going to be negotiated roughly in line with the line of control, precisely because the line of control roughly reflects the balance of power between the two parties. And if the parties do not agree, then we get to play the random lottery of war, which may move the line east or west until one side is militarily exhausted, or the line may just stay roughly where it is. But the average outcome will be relatively little movement, with high costs paid on each side. Regardless of where the line could go, it is becoming increasingly clear to me that the West needs to realize that this is the world that we live in. And if you have a problem with that, well, that is fine. Europe has gone many decades without having to confront this type of reality, and reality sucks. The problem is that complaining about injustice is not a solution, and there is a lot of complaining about injustice and relatively little problem solving, when problem solving is the thing that people really ought to be focusing on. But the next time that you see keyboard warriors suggesting that Ukraine reject any proposals that see it ceding territory to Russia, remember that the country actually making the sacrifice has now taken the position that it is an unfortunate reality. Subpoint 3. Ukraine regains control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant with US involvement, and also the Kakhovka Dam. Okay, map time. The nuclear power plant is here. It is the one that Russia captured toward the beginning of the war. Meanwhile, the Kakhovka Dam is down here. It is the one that Russia is presumed to have breached at the start of Ukraine's 2023 offensive. What is interesting about these is that I have no idea how you secure them under Ukrainian control. Let's start with the power plant. The line of control in the region is what remains of the river in the area, which drastically dropped after the dam breached. All of the scarring visible from space is due to the reservoir draining. The power plant is here. It is easy to spot because its cooling pool still exists. Now, rivers make good lines of control because they are easy to defend. And, generally speaking here, defensible positions are a good thing if you want your ceasefire to last. The European proposal is quite literally taking the opposite stance. You would have to put a contingent of Ukrainians on the other side of the river. So, I ask you, what happens if Russia decides to break the ceasefire? Well, these guys are basically done for because there is nowhere for them to retreat. It turns out that a river is a double-edged sword in this context. It is all the more interesting if the United States goes there instead. They would quickly run into the same problem of having nowhere to retreat to. On one hand, that makes them a pretty good tripwire force. It is reminiscent of Berlin in the sense that there is nowhere to run, and it might deter the opponent from entering out of a fear of escalating things into a bigger conflict. Put differently, it is a good match for the classic example of a tripwire strategy. On the other hand, it puts the United States in a really high leverage situation. Trump seems to love the idea, but I genuinely wonder if the White House has fully thought through the implications here, or is more attracted by the idea of running a nuclear power plant and somehow making money off of it. Meanwhile, the dam is in a similar situation, with the river forming the current line of control. Truly controlling the dam means putting Ukrainians on the other side of the river, albeit with the ability to retreat supposing that a navigable bridge exists. I suspect that the thought process here has to do with this, the North Crimean Canal. It used to irrigate most of the Crimean Peninsula's crops, but to have a sufficient water line, the dam needs to retain water, and this image from a moment ago shows that there is no water. So it is a money thing, and a concession to Russia. But that only works for Ukraine if Ukraine is in control of the weak point. It also ties together with the fourth subpoint. Ukraine enjoys unhindered passages on the Dnipro River and control of the Kinburn Spit. What the heck is a Kinburn Spit, you might ask? Please put away your saliva, because it is right here, with the Kakhovka Dam and the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant for spatial reference. Basically, it controls the mouth of the Dnipro River, so it is an important economic and military position. Zooming in, this would be another place where Ukraine effectively would be on an island, so add that to the list of places with questionable defensive prospects. That takes care of the territorial points. Now on to economics. Subpoint 1. The United States and Ukraine implement economic cooperation/minerals agreement. Well, at least that might forestall a repeat of the Oval Office incident. On a less sarcastic note, the apparent promise of some financial payout to the United States is helpful for having Donald Trump take ownership over the peace. So, moral quandaries aside, this makes sense. Subpoint 2. Ukraine will be fully reconstructed and compensated financially, including through Russian sovereign assets that will remain frozen until Russia compensates damage to Ukraine. Europe can actually enforce this because it holds the bulk of the Kremlin's Fortress Russia funds. However, we should free ourselves from the notion that the Kremlin will financially compensate Ukraine for the war. So I take this to mean that money will forever be held in interest-bearing accounts, and Europe will use the interest to directly pay Ukraine, and use the principal as collateral for further loans to Ukraine. And the final subpoint, U.S. sanctions imposed on Russia since 2014 may be subject to gradual easing after a sustainable peace is achieved, and subject to resumption in the event of a breach of the peace agreement. Snapback. Well, that will be a question left to Donald Trump, who seems eager to get a move on with this. Sanctions relief from the White House will not immediately result in a normal economic relationship, because many American businesses will be worried about consumer reaction to working with Russia, never mind the high uncertainty environment of moving into the country. I can say with more confidence that Trump will be eager to bring Russian oil back onto the international market, both as a way to cool inflation and deny China access to barrels below the market price. Yeah, everything goes back to China for the man. Once again, I am sure that this will be an unpopular point about the peace plan. But Russia needs some type of inducements to come to the bargaining table. The Kremlin is not continuing the war for fun. It thinks that it can do better by fighting, and thus you need to dangle a carrot in front of them to make progress. Perhaps take some comfort that Europe has learned its economic lesson and is not discussing sanctions relief. Just the United States is. I have no doubt the response you will hear about this will be very negative on social media, but keep in mind that Europe and Ukraine are under the impression that such concessions are necessary. We do not live in a fantasy world. Sometimes countries, even those fighting on the right side of history, cannot displace their military opponents. Just take a look at the Korean Peninsula if you need a parallel to the current situation. And that seems to be the general takeaway here. When I started covering this war more than 3 years ago, my central point was that wars very rarely end in one side's military defeat. Instead, one or both learn what happens when their fantasy worlds collide with reality. Well, here we are now, seemingly observing just that. Perhaps the West may take some comfort in knowing that Russia is not living in its fantasy world either, having failed to overthrow Zelensky and take an even larger chunk of Ukraine. However, we do live in a world where you can read 2 fantastic books about the war with just a few clicks. The joys of digital editions to match the printed versions. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.